So in this session here, we're going to talk about the brain on trauma. Like your brain on drugs, this is your brain on trauma. And let me preface my remarks by saying trauma makes it, when a person is traumatized, it makes it nearly impossible to have any sort of close, intimate relationships with others. The person is so haunted with the shame that they feel about themselves and what they did or did not do, and their inability to cope with those feelings, that they are severely impaired from having any kind of significant close relationship with other people. Or let's just say it's really difficult and a challenge for them. And if you haven't been traumatized, you may not understand that. If you have, you know that's true. You've probably seen it in your own life in terms of your personal growth. So they become stuck. What happens in essence is the person who's traumatized, unless they get healed, of course, is they get stuck in the trauma. They're frozen there, and they can't make sense of the suffering. They know they've been traumatized, but it's very difficult for them to make sense of, why is this still affecting me? Why am I not over it? Why am I still so negatively impacted by this? And then the coping mechanisms that they use to survive tend to be both unhealthy and destructive to their lives. So the reason for all this primarily is because the brain, if you can see it there, has been affected by trauma. I'm going to move back a little bit here. And to help you understand this, let me start with one. As I mentioned, I think earlier, the number one purpose of your brain that God gave you is to survive above anything and everything else, because nothing else will happen in terms of what God wants your brain to do if you're dead. Okay, does that make sense? So the brain is wired fundamentally. It's wired to do a lot, but fundamentally, foundationally, essentially, in terms of its primary purpose, to do what it needs to do in order to survive anything that might be perceived as a life-threatening situation. Remember, that's our definition of trauma. Trauma is an unusual and extraordinary event in which the person thinks or feels that their life has been threatened. Now, so let me kind of walk, some of you may be familiar with this, but let me kind of walk through it with you to give you, let me kind of pause here. First of all, to study on the brain is a lifelong study. And quite honestly, if you're in the healing ministries, the more you, in my opinion, the more you understand about the brain, because the brain is what God gave us that separates us from all the rest of creation. You know that. The uniqueness of man created in God's image is that he has a brain, because God has a brain. Okay? Unlike the animals has been, but you understand that the way that the brain is because we're made in the image and likeness of God. And I know that we talk about feelings and we feel that in our heart or something like that, but do understand that's metaphorically. All your feelings are taking place in your brain, not here in your physical heart, right? Okay. So the more any one of us in the healing ministry understand how God made our brains, the more effective, because it's knowledge, the more effective you're going to be in doing healing, in my opinion. So now keep in mind, though, there's a lot about the brain because it's the most complex organ we have. And if you want to see the wonder and beauty of God's majesty in creation, it's the brain. And obviously, to comprehend that, you're never going to comprehend is where I'm going with it. So I'm just kind of giving you kind of a fundamental understanding of the brain to help you in your ministry. When we get to level 3, we'll talk about it even more. You have 5 brains, in essence. Is how it's referred to. You have a left brain, for example. You have a right brain. You have a survival, what I call the survival brain, because I'm not an evolutionist. So as you begin independently to study the brain, you begin to realize that most of the scientists and researchers that are discussing the brain are evolutionists, because they believe the brain developed over a long period of time that make man unique from the other animals. Now, the good part of all this is that there has been a great deal in the last 10 years and primarily the last 5 years, studies on the brain and how it works. And so today we're able, if you want to do a little study, to know more about the brain than we've ever had and have a better understanding of ourselves and others and how we can help. So you have a left brain and a right brain. Let's start there. I think most of you know that. You may have heard that the left brain is the hemisphere, left hemisphere of the brain, is responsible for kind of the lineal kind of thinking, logical, rational, that kind of thing. And the right brain is more creative, imaginatory, right? You've heard those things. That's not true. That developed out of the 60s in initial studies, and we know today that there is no significant difference between the right and left brains. They are either in terms of gender or how a person develops personality, they're very much connected, and they really do function as one brain. The real distinction occurs in what we call the three brains, and you think of it from lower to upper story. Think of a house, for example, with a basement, one first floor, and a second floor, if that analogy helps you. So the brain is comprised of, in these three parts, one is in the very back, here in your brain stem, right here, if you put your hand right there, is this survival brain. The purpose of the survival brain is to have you and me engage in what we need to stay alive. Regulates breathing, heart rate, the blinking of your eyes, which is important so that you can see, so that you can live, eating, sleeping, sex, these basic functions of needs that people have come from what's in your brain, from the survival brain, all intended to help you survive. Now, under normal circumstances, it's kind of slumbering. You know, it's kind of running on automatic. You know what I mean? It just you don't have to think about breathing, like I said. You don't have to think about your heart rate. You don't have to think about blinking your eye. The survival brain just kind of does this, and it just kind of runs by itself until, as we'll see in a moment, something traumatic happens, and then everything suddenly changes. What was very sort of running on automatic now begins to accelerate way beyond automatic. And whereas that's good to survive a trauma, it's not so good after the trauma because it doesn't always shut down. Okay, so the second part of this brain, as you go from lower to upper story, is like the living room section, okay, the living room section, and that's called the emotional brain. And again, both of these that we're talking about, well, the emotional brain and the rational are on the left and right-hand side of your brain. So the emotional brain is comprised of primarily what's called the limbic system. And the limbic system is responsible for all of our emotions, all of our feelings, how we feel. And it records our memories. And it's not like a video camera. It records it emotionally. So like somebody mentioned that they're going to go to a wedding here in February, that their son's getting married. And so when you go to the wedding, this is the hypothetical illustration, there'll be some people there that their memory of the wedding will be a joyous celebration. Mom will remember that. Oh, wonderful. This was great. And it's not going to be a sequential, like a videotape of the memory. It'll be moments that were specifically emotionally delightful, for example. Does that make sense? That's what's going to get registered in the memory system of the limbic system. Now, there may be, I'm not saying there is, a young man that was madly in love with the girl getting married. His recollection of this wedding is going to be far different than Mom's recollection. Okay, you follow what I'm saying? And that's going to be recorded again, not like a camera, right? Emotionally for him. So you got the picture? This is important because when we talk about, remember, people telling the trauma stories, it's not a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a remembrance of significant emotional experiences and physical sensations associated with the trauma event. Now, on the very top of the house, if you will, the second story, is the rational brain. That's the fifth brain, or the third of this story, basement, living room, upper story. The rational brain is comprised primarily of what's called the neocortex. And there's different aspects of the neocortex. I'm not going to get into those specifics, but basically the rational brain, which is, and the neocortex, the rational brain takes up about 30% of your brain. It's all here in the frontal lobe. Okay, that's this part. That's why you don't want to have a traumatic brain injury up here. You don't want to hit your head. It will affect how well you think. And rational, and that's what the rational brain does in the neocortex. It's responsible for thinking, for analyzing, for assessing, for evaluating, for making decisions that are rational, okay, and reasonable. That's why, for example, if you have a teenager, I have this 17, soon to be 18-year-old granddaughter. I was talking about that she lost her key to the car I gave her, and she didn't want to really tell me what was going on. Right now, at nearly 18 years old, her neocortex is not fully developed. Okay, that's why she's supposed to have a parent, because otherwise she will make decisions like she did when she lost the key, that I'm not going to get into, but I suspect what was going on because she took an Uber and lost the key in the Uber, and why would she take an Uber? Okay, that's all I'm going to say, because it's on the recording. I'm cutting out right there. Okay, so my point is this, is that she needs help. Does that make sense? Because the neocortex and therefore the emotional brain, which is pretty much fully developed, I'm going like this, will kind of like have more control over the rational brain. So, adolescents fall in love every 10 minutes with somebody. And then they get their hearts broken. And this can be actually traumatic. I don't want to minimize that, right? You follow that. I mean, they can, emotionally, it feels like the end of the world. Now, at our ages, most of us, we all know that breaking up with your first boyfriend is not the end of the world. It's just the beginning. And so, but that comes later on. So anyway, the neocortex is the rational brain that's responsible for thinking and all that. Okay, so you got the picture, right? Okay, so what happens to your brain on trauma? When trauma occurs, the survival brain hijacks, and you can put that in quotes, the rest of the brain. You understand what I mean by hijack? It's like if a plane's hijacked or your car is hijacked. Whoever's hijacking the plane or the car, suddenly now they've taken over. They're in control. The reason why this happens is because if the person is in a life-threatening situation, whether it's a car accident we've talked about, whether it's a combat situation, whether it's a rape or a sexual assault, those are all life-threatening situations. What happens immediately is that the emotional brain sends a message. Our life is in danger. The moment the survival brain gets that message, because remember what is responsible is to survive, not the neocortex. The neocortex doesn't make a decision about about surviving. If things are functioning the way they should be, especially in the aftermath, the neocortex now comes to play a role. How do we get through this now after we've survived? You with me? But in that moment that the emotional and limbic system sends the message, we're going to die, we're going to be in this car wreck, and we're not going to survive it. I know that feeling, because when I was in that car accident, and I know exactly in India, if you've been in a car accident, and maybe it was okay, or something that it didn't turn out, there is that matter of seconds where you know we're not going to pull out of this. I mean, when I was in that car accident in India, because I've been in close calls before, where you got hit and it's okay, but I knew it was a split second. I realized we're not gonna stop. We're gonna hit this guy, and it's not gonna be good. Does that make sense? The moment that happened, my emotional brain, my limbic brain says, "We're gonna die." Okay, that goes immediately to survival. Because we're shutting everything down. If I can put it that way. Everybody stop. Everybody else, the rest of the brain, stop. We're taking over. Because we got to survive. And nothing else matters. What you're thinking, how you feel, what your future is, where you went to school, none of that matters now. All that matters is we got to survive, and I'm going to have you survive this. Okay? Metaphor, you got the picture. So what does it do? When it kicks in, as I said, it would immediately do one of a number of things. One, it will cry out for help. So if you've ever been in a life-threatening situation, you know that there's a scream, there's usually a scream, that's the survival brain. Just like when I asked you earlier, how many are hungry and you want to go to take a nap, and you can just feel that. Same is true in a life-threatening situation. The survival brain kicks in, tells your vocal cords, scream for help. If no help comes, the next thing that will happen is that the survival brain will say we're going to either run from this or we're going to fight this. And then so the heart will start to accelerate. Now this all happens in a matter of seconds. Do you follow that? Heart rate will start to accelerate, breathing will become more shallow, adrenaline will pump through the system because the survival brain is sending the message to the rest of the brain, primarily the neocortex. Can we survive this? Do we need to get out of this, or do we need to fight this? Because the neocortex even, at that point, make a decision about what to do. You with me? But the survival brain is telling us we've got to do one or the other. If there is no way to fight or flight, it goes back to the survival brain, if you will, and the survival brain goes, okay, we're shutting everything down. We just freeze. Remember I shared that with you about how often when a woman is sexually assaulted, she'll just go immobilize. She'll just freeze. This is true in combat too. Guys that are in combat and they're calling for help or they're trying to run or fight and it's not working, they'll just shut down. They'll just paralyze, they'll just stop. Okay, so all that's designed by the survival brain to get the person through the trauma. Okay, so now we take a deep breath. We're through the trauma. We didn't die. Okay, it was a horrible experience. Terrible things happened, but the accident's over. The combat's over. The sexual assault's over. We're back in our homes. We're back with people who love us. You know, all those things. We're going on with life. Everything's fine, except it's not fine, because remember. The brain still remembers. We really had the emotional brain and the neocortex both remember, wow, whew, that was close. We just had a really bad experience. So we're going to keep that kind of registered here. Limbic section remembers the event, remember emotionally. Emotionally, remember that? So it's there. Now what happens if something triggers those emotions in that limbic system, the emotional brain, again, you with me? It sends a message, what? We're going to die. You understand? And so what happens? The survival brain kicks back in and says, okay, here we go again. I'm taking over in order for us to survive. So what will happen? Now remember, there is no life-threatening situation. There's just some sort of trigger, if you will, that reminds the person of the traumatic event. So maybe it's a smell, maybe it's a place, maybe it's a situation, maybe it's something that they see. It may be it could be a thought that intrudes. There's a whole host of possibilities that could occur. Regardless, once the emotional brain gets that message and sends out, we're going to die, the survival brain kicks in again and says, okay, we got to survive. So what are we going to do? We're going to cry out for help. Okay? Now, if there's no help that comes, and so what I mean by help that comes is help the person overcome the horrific feelings of the trauma again. So they could talk about it, they could shout out about it, they could do this, but if it doesn't help, are you with me? That doesn't work. And so the person still feels like what? We're going to die. And so at that point, then the fight or flight comes back in. And so the person might become, for example, very angry and lash out. Okay, that's one of the symptoms, right? You understand what I'm saying? They might have negative opinions about everything. They might become highly anxious. All this is taking place because the survival brain is telling the rest of the brain, we need to get through this. And so these other aspects, the anxiety, the anger, the irritability, whatever it might come to, or it might say, let's avoid. And so the person begins to distance, begins to polarize, doesn't want to be with people, becomes avoidant. Okay, you with me? So that suddenly now, as the survival brain tries to help the person survive, the person will try to do things in order to survive this feeling again of the trauma reoccurring. And so that's when they might start to try to do things that are very unhealthy and destructive for them. They might try to, okay, how am I going to deal with all these feelings now and the memory of this again because it got triggered by this thing or this person, place. Well, you know what? Maybe I'll drink. Maybe I'll smoke some dope. Maybe I'll go out and be promiscuous. Maybe I'll eat a bunch of Krispy Kreme donuts. I don't know. Or maybe, you know what? I just need to be alone. I don't want to be around anybody. I don't want to go to work. I can't function. I'm going to be sad. I'm going to be depressed. Are you okay? Sorry?
Well, they commit suicide.
Or they could commit suicide in very extreme situations. And so if none of that works, okay, none of that works, the person will freeze. They'll become numb. They won't feel. And you'll see this in traumatized person. They report, I don't feel anything. I don't have any feelings. So if you hear that, you know now what's gone on. The survival brain has overtaken so much of this person's brain, which is everything they are, that now they can't even feel as a way of surviving. Okay, do you kind of have that? Do you have that understanding?